Before I received my autism diagnosis, I often thought there were these times where I was having intense panic attacks, where my heart would start racing, I would feel overwhelmed, I would start sweating. But when I did get that autism diagnosis and started learning more about meltdowns, I realized that those moments might have actually been meltdowns. Now, fortunately, I'm doing a little bit better at distinguishing between the two, between the times I'm having panic attacks and the times I'm having meltdowns. And knowing the key differences between the two can really help you address that situation. And so that's why in this video, we're going to take some time to distinguish the key differences between panic attacks and meltdowns. Now, before I begin, I do want to quickly mention that I hope you do not use this video to diagnose yourself. If you're having these symptoms, it is helpful to contact a professional that you can talk through these situations to help you have a better plan of how to engage with what is happening. Having said that, let's start with a quick definition of both meltdown and panic attack. So a panic attack is a sudden moment of intense fear or anxiety that results in physical symptoms. The definition of meltdown will sound pretty similar to that. That definition is that a meltdown is an intense, uncontrollable reaction to an overwhelming situation. And now I will put a link in the description below that will give you more detail about what a meltdown actually is. So because the definitions sound so similar, it's important for us to dive into those key differences. And the first key difference involves the symptoms. Now, both meltdowns and panic attacks can involve a quickening heartbeat and sweating, but usually panic attacks go further and that the physical symptoms also involve like a sense that you're maybe choking or that you can't breathe or that you feel a lot of chest pain or pressure on your chest. And for me, it usually feels like there's like someone sitting on my chest or there's like this tightening in my chest. Now, the second key difference is the onset. The onset between a meltdown and a panic attack is usually a bit different. Panic attacks usually come very suddenly and very quickly. It just kind of hits you out of nowhere. Conversely, a meltdown usually takes a day or two to ramp into, and you can kind of feel the sense of overwhelm building. It's kind of like blowing up a balloon. You kind of sense that there's a little bit of air in, more air in, more air in, until eventually you get to that burst when there's too much air in. So it kind of takes a little bit of time to have the meltdown occur. And that's because the triggers or what causes the meltdown or the panic attack tend to be a little bit different. For panic attacks, usually it's kind of a one thing, one situation, one memory, maybe one thing that you just smelled or one encounter. And it's that one thing, that one situation, that one memory that makes your body think it's in danger, and that causes the fear and the anxiety. Conversely, for meltdowns, that trigger is the intense overwhelm, and usually this is because of sensory inputs. And so again, think of your senses, right? Your touch, taste, smell, all of that there's just too much information coming into the brain, and the brain cannot process that information, and that is what leads to that overwhelm. Another key difference is kind of the duration of the symptoms or the duration of what is happening. Like I said, panic attacks usually come on very suddenly, but they also usually kind of fade more quickly than meltdowns. And so like you might have that panic attack, experience that symptom for an intense 30 minutes or an hour, and then usually the symptoms kind of go away. So it's kind of a quick 30-minute, an hour experience. For meltdowns, it can take a lot longer to recover from what happened. That you might take a day or two to have to recover from what happened. And that brings us to our last difference, and that is how to address the situation. Now, I've actually seen breathing techniques recommended for both meltdowns and panic attacks. So doing things like 4 square breathing, which is where you breathe in for 4 seconds, hold your breath for 4 seconds, breathe out for 4 seconds, and hold for 4 seconds, and kind of repeat that cycle. That can be something that you do regardless of if it's a panic attack or a meltdown. But for meltdowns, usually our priority should be to get people away from sensory information, not add into that sensory input. So like, don't touch them, don't talk to them. Usually it's helpful if we kind of reduce the sensory input. So closing our eyes might be helpful. Going to a quiet, dark room might be helpful. And so those are some of the things we might do differently in a meltdown, as opposed to a panic attack, which is usually much more about, again, that stress management techniques, grounding techniques. That's the times where you kind of say to yourself, I'm going to think of 5 things that I see. I'm going to think of 4 things that I'm touching, 3 things that I smell, 2 things I hear, and so on. Now, panic attacks and meltdowns are certainly not the only thing that get confused for one another. Many autistic people, especially autistic children, often have their meltdowns interpreted as tantrums when those 2 things are actually different. And so in our next video, we're going to talk about the key differences between a tantrum and an autistic meltdown.